So China also serves as this diplomatic alternative. You mentioned earlier too, with what China did with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we can go on and on and on with the Belt and Road Initiative. And if China maintains a positive relationship with the United States and is able to do all of these diplomatic, economic, and political policies regarding cooperation, that I don't know if there's any bigger threat to the United States in its own mind, at least in the minds of those who who conduct foreign policy, the foreign policy establishment. There's no bigger threat to the foreign policy establishment than a country that can both engage in positive relations with a so-called adversary and at the same time maintain an independent political and, of course, economic posture.
Absolutely. And people have to understand that if you have a supremacist mentality, you believe you are superior to these other groups of people. You are superior to the Chinese. The Chinese had been subordinated to the West. The British and the Americans had been on the road toward colonizing China and humiliated China over the course of an entire century. And then you see them building themselves up, reaching parity, and then preparing to surpass you. I mean, think about it from a couple of different perspectives. Just the fear of comeuppance, the West paying for what it has done to China for generations now. Just that alone probably keeps them up at night. But then also, what if you have built everything predicated on supremacy, controlling the planet, monopolizing industry and markets, and now all of that is disappearing. It's being displaced by this alternative that China is helping create. What future do you have? You have no future. You will never accept a place among other nations because you believe you should be imposing yourself upon all other nations. And so it is a mentality, and it's deeply rooted. I don't think people understand it. It's institutionally rooted in the United States. The education side. I mean, I'm an American. I was born and raised in the United States. I went through the U.S. education system. I watched American television programming, U.S. media. This is the mindset that every American, this is what at least tries to take root. Thankfully, for a lot of Americans, it doesn't. But we're taught that we are the best, and we cannot accept this. And it's an existential threat, even though it isn't. It's an existential threat that we're not number one, even though it's not actually any sort of existential threat. So, it's so dangerous. And we don't know how far the current circles of power in the U.S., how far they're going to go with all of this. Look at what they've done to Ukraine. Look at how dangerously close to direct conflict with Russia they've brought us. Look at what they're doing in the Middle East right now. What would they do to prevent this non-white nation from surpassing the U.S.? What would they do? And I honestly don't know the answer to that question. China seems very serious about covering all of its bases and creating a significant enough deterrent and a significant enough ability to weather whatever the United States decides to do, it and its allies decide to do.
Yeah, and it brought me back to Palestine. When I was in Vietnam, I thought to myself, wow, what if, Palestine is like this very particular situation which we thought was a thing of the past, right? Colonialism and an entire nation not having virtually any, not even nominal sovereignty, not even any recognition, in being oppressed in this way. Then you're in a place like Vietnam, and you're like, wow, look what people can do when they have liberated themselves from that. And China is almost at another level, because while Vietnam has a lot of achievements, it's still relatively poor, and it has a long way to go, because it's only had, I think, 3 decades. Less than 3 decades since it was out of sanctions. And if anybody knows the history of Vietnam and how much it was bombed, you'd understand why development is still very much a work in progress. But China's at this other level entirely. It is this example of a country that with regard to that Economist article, they said a threat was national sovereignty being prioritized over universal values. And that to me is a euphemism for universal values, a euphemism for rules-based international order, or whatever the United States
which is a
wants, right?
euphemism for American imperialism. I mean,
Exactly. Whatever the
yeah.
United States wants, U.S. imperialism, its dominance, its rules, its values. And so I think what's important to remember here, whether we're looking at the Taiwan situation, whether we're looking at any flashpoint with regard to the United States and its conflict with China, that China is kind of the standard bearer of what the United States never wants to happen. They call it, in that Economist article, they also call China almost like another Soviet Union, because they see China as this competing power that came from a place where they'd much rather China be, which is a place of destitution, of complete and utter oppression, no sovereignty, super exploited. They want that China back, but instead, this world that you talk about, Ryan, like it's not a bad thing that the United States is no longer the, dominant power in the world. The problem is that when that happens, the world is actually a better place, because what the United States has done with its hegemony has actually been disastrous for much of the world, has actually led the world into a much darker place. And that is set to possibly end. And the world could be better with China and, of course, these other countries doing things differently, prioritizing sovereignty, prioritizing development, prioritizing prosperity for everybody, prioritizing lifting the poorest of us out first, versus allowing the wealthiest and the richest to essentially run away with everything.
Absolutely. And I have been here in Asia almost my entire adult life, and in particular here in Thailand. And I've watched the transformation. And you have to think about it. It's not just Thailand as this contained country here in Southeast Asia. You have to think about the entire region and who was primarily influencing the region, say 20 years ago, and who's primarily influencing it right now. And how has the change been? Has it been from negative to positive? And I would say absolutely. It's gone from negative to a very positive situation. You can see development taking place only because of China's rise. And if it wasn't for China's rise, the US would still be in this region trying to divide nations against each other, trying to divide nations internally. I think that has been the main problem for Southeast Asia. A lot of the countries here, Thailand excluded, who's the only country in Southeast Asia not colonized by Western powers, but all of Thailand's neighbors were colonized by European powers, the British Empire, the French Empire, and they deliberately created all of these political, religious, ethnic divisions to divide and conquer. And when these countries gained their independence, the French, the British, and then the United States, they didn't just say, oh, good luck with your independence. No, they continued investing in these divisions. They did not want these nations, just like you say, Danny, China is their biggest fear. A nation that they had once subjugated rising up above them. They do not want to see that. But think about the type of human being you have to be for that to be your values and your desires, your ambitions in the world, is to keep everyone else down. It's so funny. You see people worried about what China's doing. China's demonstrably creating an international system where national sovereignty holds primacy. There is no arbiter declaring, including not even China, that's going to declare what can and cannot happen inside somebody's sovereign borders. They're very clear about that. And they're creating a very careful balance of power internationally that will prevent them from doing that, even if in the future some sort of administration comes into power in China that is tempted to do that. They're not going to be able to, because of the nature of this multipolar system that is being created. It's compare and contrast it with the United States. It is not just China rising as the next America or the next British Empire. It is unique, and I think people need to recognize that. And we have to understand at the root of this, it's not about politics or ideology. It's about Russia, China, many other nations working very hard to create tangible alternatives, alternative infrastructure, financial institutions, factories that are producing goods that only the West used to make and to dominate certain markets. They are creating all of these alternatives. And by creating these alternatives, now you have many on the playing field. It creates a better balance of power. It's not designed to be perfect and solve all problems. It's designed to balance power and check the worst impulses of any individual nation or group of nations.